Welcome everybody. Good morning. Happy Friday. My name is Maggie Lamborn. I'm a senior manager at Dexis Consulting Group, where I support the monitoring, evaluation, and learning and our security cooperation programming. I have the pleasure of moderating this panel on the role of emerging technologies in local and global peacekeeping. As we all know, data-informed decision-making is a buzz phrase in our industry these days, and for good reason. I know in my own work, I see almost daily the impact of informed decisions and unfortunately the consequences of very ill-informed decisions. But those of you who are like me, oftentimes it's easy to get overwhelmed by the data or understanding which data is the most useful to make decisions. There's a plethora of publicly available information and it's growing every minute of every day. And similarly, the events that destabilize or undermine the peace of our world are also increasing. So in an effort to answer this, we have assembled a panel of experts who can help us understand how to make our critical decisions in difficult situations and manage our responses to them. These experts are going to guide us through their own innovations in artificial intelligence and machine learning, satellite imagery, early warning systems, forecasting mechanisms, and how these innovations can help support the different phases of peace building. Our panelists are going to offer solutions that overcome challenges to obtain real-world and real-time publicly available information that forecasts violence in advance, produce census-like trust, social cohesion, and other attitudinal data using artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the use of artificial intelligence machine learning to alert us to breaking events, enabling fast real-time responses, and collecting randomized population samples of public sentiment that can foretell divisive issues. So the goal of this is to showcase the role of technology-informed data in project design, management, and early warning or predictive analytics, and conflict prevention and stabilization, as well as to share data analytics and how it's a key function of programming and peace building, at least it is for Dexis, and how we can leverage partners and experts such as those that are featured on today's panel. Just a brief overview of how we're going to run this session. I will have the pleasure of introducing our experts, and I'm going to do so prior to each of their remarks, after which they will share and present their innovations. Following all the presentations by the panelists, we're going to have a moderated Q&A. Starting first with a few questions that have been submitted in advance, but second, we're going to open it up to questions from you in the audience. Feel free to put questions in the chat as we go. We're going to monitor and raise them with the panel when we get to that point. We should have about 30 to 40 minutes for Q&A, so there should be plenty of time, so don't be shy. And with that, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first panelist. Mr. Sam Powers is the Senior Director of Data&E, where he manages the company's relationships with the United Nations, international NGOs, and nonprofits. He is a published expert in the field of open source information and previously served as an analyst focused on the use of social media and misinformation in areas of conflict. Sam is the co-founder and executive director of the Lens on Life project, a global NGO that provides digital media training for youth. In his capacity as executive director, Sam is the focal point for security across programming in Iraq, Cameroon, the DRC, Jordan, and the US. Sam.
Thanks a lot, Maggie. So my job here is pretty simple. I'm here to set the stage for what we understand, to be a massive surge in the amount of publicly available information. It's pretty clear, obviously, that the use of the internet has surged, especially in the last 2 years. But what some might not know is that 64% of the planet is now using the internet, right? And the majority of those are using it for mobile phones. So as we look at the role that data plays in peacekeeping, we can see very clearly just from some simple statistics in front of us that the majority of folks across the world are now using the internet, and they are now using it via mobile phones. That provides a huge sensor network to us in terms of the amount of publicly available data that's readily available. Next slide, please. Now, this data, 90% of the world's data has been created within the last 2 years. We're expected to grow to 180 zettabytes of data by 2025. the number of internet users has grown by 98 million over the past 12 months, all to say that there's a ton of data out there that can be leveraged, that can be used for protecting our planet, for keeping people safe, and for keeping the mission of peace building alive. Now, if we look at this, right, and at Data we've had the ability to do so, the amount of PAI and the diversity of PAI has skyrocketed day by day. So what used to be just social media, right, 500 million tweets per day, for example, has now grown exponentially to include ground sensor networks, code repositories, regional and local social media, microblogs, deep and dark web forums, all rich data that allows us the ability to look at events in real time, to keep people safe, and ultimately to provide alerts on our end to those clients that we care about, especially in the peacekeeping domain. Next slide. Now, what does this look like in practice, right? So at Data we have the ability to provide notifications to our clients, including peacekeepers across the world, to things that are going on in real time, breaking events. So what starts as a tweet, or what starts as a ground sensor network, or what starts as a notification from a government handle, right? These are the types of things that for people in the field, for people in a peacekeeping environment, save a life, could make a huge difference to their day, and ultimately provide that notification that will allow them to stay clear of harm, right? So I've seen this from.
My headphones on.
Sorry, is there someone on the line? I've seen this come through in multiple fashions, right? From a notification in the DRC alerting me to stay clear of danger, to a ground sensor network on social media alerting of an earthquake to our colleagues in the UN. Obviously, the recent events in Khartoum and Sudan, we are seeing publicly available information, like I described earlier, provide those real-time critical updates. And in order to explain how the role of AI can help in managing this level of PAI, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Alex James. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. If I can introduce Alex really fast. Our next panelist is Dr. Alex James, who is a chief scientist and senior vice president of artificial intelligence at Data He's also a visiting professor at Cornell Tech. He is a leader in artificial intelligence and has built products used by millions of people and was an early voice in human-centered artificial intelligence. He has over 100 patents and publications in top-tier conferences and journals on artificial intelligence and has been featured widely in the press. He was an expert in the Colombian government's Artificial Intelligence Expert Mission, which advised the president on artificial intelligence policies. Alex is a mentor at Endeavor and Techstars and a member of the advisory board of Digital Divide Data, a nonprofit that creates sustainable tech opportunities for communities in Asia and Africa. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you for having me. We could start right away. Next. So AI has been in the media pretty much everywhere in recent years, and that has really increased in the last few months very significantly. And everyone's wondering what sort of impact it's going to have and how well it's going to work and what is it. So I want to start with a little bit of history and framing of AI. Next one. The reality is AI has been around for a very long time. Some of the concepts are very, very old, going back hundreds of years. But modern AI really started in the, perhaps you could say, 80s, 90s. There was a really big jump around 2012 with the development of deep learning algorithms, which is what we're seeing today. Next one. And in general, AI can be classified into two categories. There's predictive AI and there's generative AI. Generative AI is a fairly new thing that really started in the last few years. Next slide. Predictive AI is all about classification and labeling. So any task where you have repetitive patterns and you can label new information and classify new information. I hear an echo. So classification labeling is all that predictive AI does, and that's been around for decades. Generative AI, on the other hand, focuses on generation of content, and you've seen systems generate images, that generate audio, that generate text through human prompts or small inputs. And next slide. As I said, the predictive component has been used for decades and has been applied in many industries and areas, in spite of all the hype in recent months and years. All of this has been around for a very long time in advertising, manufacturing, search, customer support, spam detection and email, social media, news, and transportation. So the big jump in recent months has been that it's really become more open, and people have become more aware of what's going on. But it's been around for a while, particularly the predictive one. Next one. Now, we're seeing a point of convergence between these two subfields of artificial intelligence, and there are interesting ways to leverage both kinds of techniques. The underlying technologies are kind of the same in both cases, and they're all around data and statistics and basically identifying patterns in data and then using those patterns to make predictions of either something in the future or something in the past on one hand. And with generative AI, it's really about taking those patterns and generating new data based on those patterns. Next slide. And the way to succeed in AI is really by leveraging three phenomena that we've seen in recent decades and in the last 5 to 10 years. A huge increase in data, which Sam talked about. Most of that is public data. And if you read about some of the recent advances in AI, you'll find that a lot of those systems have been trained on open data, on the web, publicly available information, all kinds of publicly available information. So data is a key component. It turns out that generic public data is not sufficient. You typically need domain-specific data for these systems to work well. But you also need the advances in the algorithms, which is one of the things that has changed in recent years. So lots of AI advances, and you need processing power. So when you combine all of these three elements, you're able to build a platform that is very powerful and sufficient to identify events and label them and so on and so forth. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, and one way of breaking up the space of public data is by looking at the kinds of data. So we have computer vision, which deals with techniques that address labeling in images and video, natural language processing, which detects patterns in text, but also generates text, audio and speech understanding, detecting and labeling audio and speech, and then machine and sensor data. Next slide. So in a centralized model, and this is kind of the way that 911 and emergency services work, somebody calls in, there's an emergency, that emergency gets reported to a particular individual or a call center, and then it gets forwarded. And obviously, when you have this system, it's still very valuable, but the information travels through these hops, and so it's a bit slower than in the public setting because it has to go through one hub, and then that hub decides who it sends it to. Next slide. When you're looking at public data, you're looking at a broadcast model, and with public data, the assumption is it's public. So whenever you post something, whether it's the web or social media or it's sensor data or traffic cam or whatever it is, it's available everywhere immediately. So the speed is significantly higher, the scale is really worldwide, and the range covers the entire world. So very significant difference between the previous model and the broadcast model. Next slide, please. So a platform like Data-Miner, the way that it works is we take in all of these data sources, we identify events. So that's the predictive part. It's predicting events that already happened, and the prediction is just the labeling. So somebody posts something on either the web or social media or whatever it is, and the platform will identify a pattern and predict what it is that happened. So it's predictions in the past, because we're not doing predictions in the future. And then it uses the generation part to generate a summary of the event. And those are the alerts that we send out. So I want to highlight the generation part because one of the problems in all of this data is that it's too much. And we need systems to identify and summarize and pick up the most important parts of whatever is out there. So the prediction helps us identify. The generation part helps us summarize in a concise way. Next slide. And one of the projects that we did earlier this year was with the UN Human Rights Office, where we did some work on identifying threats to human rights defenders. Next one, using the platform and some of these ideas. Next and last slide. And so I want to take the opportunity to let everyone know that we have a new program for AI for Good. We're inviting applications from NGOs and multilateral organizations to work with us like we did with the UN Human Rights Office. So the way that it works is you submit a proposal, and if you get selected, you get to work with our AI organization and going forward. It's on our website under the About section. So that will end. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Our next panelist is Dr. Katayun Kishi, who is the head of data science at ACLED and has been with the organization since April of 2019. She manages the storing, organizing, and improvement of ACLED data, oversees the weekly publication of data, advises on new approaches to improving data collection and management, and leads ACLED's data science initiatives. Dr. Kishi holds a PhD in government and politics from the University of Maryland with a concentration in comparative politics and quantitative methodology. Her primary research interests are conflict forecasting and its use in humanitarian early warning systems. She previously held positions at the Pew Research Center. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. The Pew Research Center and the United States Institute of Peace. Katayun?
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Today I wanted to chat quickly with you about what ACLED is and how we sort of handle data, and then our newest sort of tool, which looks at preventing conflict by sort of creating a prediction model. So really briefly, I'll go over what ACLED is. So ACLED stands for the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. We are a global data set that covers political violence events and demonstrations in near real time. We publish events weekly, and we cover 244 countries and territories, so completely global, and also at the subnational level with everything geocoded. One important element of our data is that it's entirely human coded and reviewed. So we are not sort of a machine ingesting data set that sort of crawls different sources and pulls events sort of automatically. Everything is reviewed, coded, and then reviewed through several rounds by actual people. And our data are publicly available. Next slide. So our newest kind of data science tool to go along with this event data is called ACLED CAST. It's our conflict alert system. And this is a predictive model that basically looks at the number of organized violence events that will occur in the next 1 to 6 months. So specifically, we look at the number of battle events, explosions and remote violence events, and violence against civilian events that will happen in each country and also in each admin 1 area. So that's the province level. These forecasts are updated every month, and we forecast out up to 6 months into the future. And it is global as well. So you can look at forecasts for basically anywhere that you're interested in. And the data are available via download through API or through a static file on our website. Next. So I won't go too far into depth about how exactly the model works, but just to give you a sense of what's going into it and how the calculations are done. We have a wide sort of variety of predictors that are fed into the machine learning model that will then drive what the forecasts are. A lot of these predictors are from ACLED data itself. So it could be things that are sort of directly pulled from the existing events. So things like the number of battle events in the previous month, the number of protests in a neighboring administrative division, or it can be things that we sort of derive from the data. So the number of effective conflict actors, for example. So not just looking at whether there are 10 actors present in an area, but rather looking at how many events they're engaged in. And perhaps if one is engaged in 10 times as many events as the rest, that number of effective actors in that space is actually lower than you might think. We also pull in population data externally and then infant mortality rates as sort of a proxy for economic development. Next. So the model creation process, sort of simplified, is that we run machine learning models for every country separately. So this is not a single global forecast, and instead each model is trained on specific data from that country. We look at data since 2018, split out by country, and then sort of create a training data set versus a test data set. So the test data are the last 6 months of available data that we have. And then the training data are basically split up into different chunks that we can use to train the models on, look at what the forecasts are that they're creating, and then compare that to the sort of held out last 6 months of data that we excluded to see which of the various algorithms that we're feeding the model performed the best. Once we've established for that country which of the algorithms was the best one, we'll go back and we'll apply that and train the entirety of the data set on it to create the out of sample forecasts for the next 1 to 6 months. Next. So the conflict alert system, the main sort of tool itself is a dashboard. This is a screenshot of the dashboard that's up on our website. The whole thing is fully interactive, so you don't need to have any sort of prior knowledge about machine learning models or anything like that to be able to use it and to look up specifically the forecasts for countries you're interested in or for provinces that you're interested in, as well as being able to kind of contextualize that information. So if I'm telling you that there's going to be 600 events in Ukraine next month, that sounds like a lot of events, but you can quickly look at our dashboard and see that Ukraine on average has 3,000 events in a month. And so that's quite a significant decrease, for example. So it kind of contextualizes for you what direction that forecast is relative to what that country typically sees. And we also include a bit of explanatory AI as well in this dashboard. There's a tab called What's Driving the Forecasts that goes into sort of lifting the veil on the black box that can be a lot of machine learning models. So it tells you exactly which of the predictors that we're feeding it seem to contribute the most to the end kind of prediction. So in one area, it might be that the number of battles in the previous month was quite significant. In another place, it might be the number of military and civilian interactions that was really driving the forecast for the following month. Next. So one thing I want to note as we kind of, as people are developing these machine learning models more and applying them increasingly to conflict and peace building in particular is, when is this an important tool to use in your toolkit? And when is it perhaps not the most appropriate one to use? Because it's certainly not a silver bullet and something that can, sort of serve as a crystal ball looking into the future and for every situation. So the way I like to think about it is sort of this, these categories from Karl Popper about clouds versus clocks. And so clouds are irregular, disorderly, not really predictable, whereas clocks are regularly and orderly, and you can kind of derive a pattern from them quite quickly. And then there's also black swan events, which are different a little bit from just rare events in that they have a low probability of occurring, but even conditional on other variables being present at the time. So I'll give you some examples of these. Next. So Palestine, for example, is a cloud kind of case. So you can see here the bars represent observed events that we've seen for each month in Palestine. The red colored bars represent anomalies. So these are months that had 2 or more standard deviations above the mean as far as the number of events. You can see in Palestine that happens fairly regularly, where you have sudden spikes in violence. The orange line represents the forecast that the model was making. And the numbers inside the bars represent the sort of the differential between the observed number of events and the forecasted number. So you can see here, machine learning is perhaps not the best tool when it comes to looking at Palestine. The forecasts tend to be underrepresenting because they're heavily skewed by the more recent sort of upticks in violence. Palestine also only has 2 administrative divisions, the West Bank and Gaza. So there's not a lot of sort of external information that the model can pull in and to form better predictions and determine patterns. So this is perhaps the case where using human intelligence or other types of trend setting would be better, a better use case. Next. Then we have something like Mexico, which is actually a sort of an ideal candidate for using machine learning to predict out to events. So you can see here, Mexico has a lot of events each month, on average about 600 or so events, and a decent amount of variation. It's not, sort of always right at 600. And you can see that the forecast actually trends pretty nicely with the actual number of events that we see. And actually, our most recent forecast from looking at March, we were only off by a single event in terms of being able to predict the total number of events in Mexico right on the dot. So this is a great sort of candidate for being able to use machine learning. Next. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So lastly, I'll talk about Sudan, which is kind of our most recent Black Swan event to have occurred. You can see that Sudan, up until this most recent sort of surge in fighting, was a pretty good candidate for machine learning. There's not a lot of anomalies happening. If anything, our models were slightly over predicting the number of events. And then all of a sudden you have sort of an outbreak of violence. And something like that is very difficult to try to model out and predict using these machine learning models. A lot of that comes down to kind of the technicalities behind how these algorithms are run, but especially in the case of Sudan, where you have sort of these latent tensions that are rising over time, and the actual events on the ground don't reflect those rising tensions. It's very difficult to try to quantify that. And so trying to build in human intelligence and using that in tandem with something like machine learning would be a really ideal scenario. Next. Great, so just if you are interested in accessing the forecasting model and also any of our other early warning tools, that's all available on our website. And you can also contact us at the email you see on the screen to set up an account and be able to explore a bit. So thank you so much.
Thank you. We will now hear from Ms. Natasha Hissey, who serves as the Vice President and General Manager of International Development at ReWe, a technology company that provides real-time sentiment data worldwide. She brings more than 20 years of international development program design and implementation experience in global health, governance, and conflict-related programming. Natasha is reimagining how advances in data collection tools can help implementers use better evidence for programming, including in conflict prevention and adaptive management. Natasha?
Thanks, Maddie. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Well, thanks. There's been really an explosion of data that is becoming available. And as you heard from Data Miner and Akhled, the tools and level of sophistication is getting us closer and closer to where the action is happening and faster than ever. And we want data, but we want to make sure that we're hearing from a diversity of voices. And so the question is always, how do we get those voices? How do we make sure that we're actually hearing what people's experiences are really like? And one piece of data that is really important to understand is population sentiment, which is what ReWe is focused on. So not just asking a few people in some focus groups, but broad population sentiment. What I mean by that is, what are people feeling, perceiving? Wouldn't it be great if you could ask people closest to the situation, what are they thinking and feeling right at the moment? That used to be, getting people to do face-to-face surveys, which can be dangerous, expensive, opens up lots of methodological issues relating to coverage bias, selection bias, interviewer bias, and social desirability bias. Next slide. So what is ReWe really solving? Well, we're looking for the quiet voices. What we mean by that are really the people who are not regularly voicing their opinion. So this is quite literally the opposite of social media listening. That is really about the loudest voices in the room. So the types of people that we are looking for oftentimes are people who are not, they may not be politically active. They're not the ones, raising their hand. They may be unemployed. They are hard to reach. They're not, picking up the phone. That's young people. And we wanted to create a solution that really allows for true anonymity. So imagine if you could actually be anonymous. Would you answer a sensitive question differently? So when we do field data collection traditionally, we spend a lot of time recruiting data collectors who are speaking the same language, they're the same gender. There's all these things that we do trying to minimize this interviewer bias and interviewer effects. But there's lots of reason why answering a survey from someone who belongs to your community can actually be intimidating and threatening. And so as researchers, we constantly underestimate how people want to please and essentially give a socially desirable answer. And social desirability bias happens when a person answering a survey wants to give a socially desirable answer. It's what we think of as being perhaps a politically correct answer. And really has lots and lots of examples from past US elections, Brexit, that really demonstrates this. And lastly, we wanted to create a solution that would allow anyone to capture data in real time and continuously. So next slide. So, one of the things that Sam mentioned is really the explosion of the internet and the access to cheap mobile phones. And with the increase in access to cheap mobile phones is really then our ability to understand human sentiment on a much broader scale than ever before. So we created a new way of gathering data from essentially people surfing over the internet. We're deploying surveys to be answered in real time, and it allows us to not just reach a couple of people here and there, but people nationally in a very short period of time. So where do we do this? We do this in places in restricted environments. What I mean by that is the government is restricting access to information. We do a lot of work in China, in Iran, in Russia, in places that are in crisis, where it might be difficult to access. So places like Myanmar and Afghanistan and Ukraine. And looking at very specific topics. So things in health, in media literacy, and rule of law and human rights. A lot of these topics where you can ask sensitive questions. Next slide. So essentially, Rewe is intercepting people on the internet as they're doing their regular activities. They're scrolling through Facebook, Telegram, whatever it is. And it allows us to access people who are living in rural areas. They may have inconsistent access to electricity, but they have a cheap mobile phone that can be accessed by us, essentially. So we know this because our survey data shows that we're clearly reaching people in all geographic areas, income groups, education levels, and gender. Whether it's you're trying to reach young people, you're trying to reach women in places like, for example, in Afghanistan, where it's very difficult to do so now. And all of the surveys are essentially mobile, such that we are trying to make it easy for people to take a survey on very low bandwidth. Slide 5. Now, the fun stuff. So, Sudan has been in the news in the last 2 weeks now. And, but those working in Sudan know that things have been actually brewing there for quite some time. We collected data late last year, asking people on the likelihood of a coup in the next 60 days. Note the language used in the question. We didn't ask, is the RSF and the army going to go to war at each other? No, this is essentially a proxy question about the levels of instability in the country. Like, what do you feel like is happening right now? And in Sudan, we asked people to self-report their location because the internet infrastructure is not great, but you'll notice that we got very good coverage nationwide. We'll look at a country next where we have very good geolocation and where people don't have to self-report their location. The darker blue, go ahead. Sorry, go back. The darker blue is essentially representing places where people felt it was more likely or very likely that a coup was going to happen. And you can kind of see that actually all the very blue areas really have very, very high percentages and indicating that something was going to be happening. And this is data that's being collected last December. Next slide. Don't know why this looks funny. Rewe's been collecting data in Ukraine now since before the war in 2022. And we started asking people last October whether they would support a peace agreement that commits Ukraine to never joining NATO. And the very dark blue areas are places that you see very high support. They're also the places that have seen the worst fighting and that really have been really occupied by Russians. The data seems to kind of make sense, right? You look at this and you say, okay, well, maybe it's like the, places where there's a lot of Russian identifying people and therefore they would support a peace agreement with Russia that commits Ukraine to never joining NATO. However, next slide. If you filter out people who identify as Russian, so you're only looking at people who identify as Ukrainian, or Ukrainian and Russian, you see that those numbers actually stay up, that they are still quite dark blue. And in fact, both groups in occupied territories, except for Luhansk, say that, yes, they would absolutely support a peace agreement that commits Ukraine to not joining. And that this number is actually higher than for people who identify as Russian. And you might look at this and say, how does this make sense? And because in the news, we see strengthening resolve among Ukrainians to win the war. There is going to be increasing fighting in these places. And you have to ask, so how people feel about a peace agreement as the fighting intensifies? Are we going to see the same kinds of numbers that are, in the places that have seen a lot of fighting? And this is exactly the type of question where people might feel like they need to give a socially desirable answer when they're doing phone surveys or even face-to-face surveys. Next slide. So, at Really, we believe that tapping into the power of intercepting people with the internet as they're browsing the internet really gives us this unique opportunity to learn what people really want and think. And sometimes it might go against what we're seeing in other data sets. And really, we see this as something complementary, and that this can be predictive of what things will be. I think that the strength of asking proxy questions to really understand sentiment on the ground is really, really powerful. And so what I would ask folks is, what would you want to ask, and who are you not hearing?
Thank you, Natasha. Our final panelist is Melissa Persad, who is the Director of Growth at Frame. Frame bridges the data gaps by producing localized information on people's characteristics, behaviors, and attitudes that is unmatched in its scale and precision. Frame quantifies and visualizes drivers of conflict, violent extremism, and crime at the neighborhood level, and can focus on specific population subgroups, including women, youth, and Indigenous populations, to target conflict prevention programming by place and population of interest. Melissa's experience in mobile messaging, geospatial data collection, and layering across sectors brings a cross-sectoral approach to inform early warning and conflict prevention activities. Melissa?
Thanks, Maggie. Hi, everyone. I am Melissa Persad, as Maggie introduced me, and I'm here to close us out on the speaker list here. So I'm going to do my best to bridge some of these presentations and talk about some practical applications of the technologies we've been talking about today, and how Frame applies them to kind of holistic community level understanding. So at our core, Frame is mapping humanity. What that means is that we're using artificial intelligence and machine learning to produce census-like data for new and novel indicators at the community level that can be helpful and useful and practical when we think about conflict prevention, peace building, and across sectors. We're bringing, as Maggie mentioned, a wealth of experience from different development sectors and commercial applications when it comes to understanding energy, health, agriculture, and food security issues, to the complex questions of today's topics. Next slide, please. What do I mean by neighborhood level data or census-like data? We're transforming aggregated survey results that you could get from a market research firm to understand national statistics about a place. So here, for example, we're looking at the proportion of adults in Honduras who live in a home where a household member was the victim of a crime in the last 4 months. So the 21% is interesting and helpful. Also, we want to unpack this issue and understand what are the drivers of that crime. what is the kind of root of that experience? So when we talk about subnational variation, we're talking about using machine learning to predict out square kilometer estimates of this same statistic. So if you look at the map below, now we're zoomed in Honduras, and we're getting down to the neighborhood level and identifying the community level pockets of where there are significantly more households affected by crime in the last 4 months, and using that as our baseline understanding for working in a community, for entering a new place or designing a program. Next slide, please. As you can imagine, this data has a lot of broad applications. Communities are complex, people are complex, but with a holistic view, starting with a statistic of interest, drilling down to a community, and producing the same level of granularity for attitudinal, behavioral, perception, preference-based indicators. You have a new level of insight into informing the levers to pull for conflict prevention and stabilization programming. You have a wealth of information at your fingertips for the places in which we want to focus, understanding the population subgroups. So as Natasha mentioned, thinking about the underrepresented voices in data and bringing that down to the community level to inform better decisions, rapidly make programmatic investments, and roll out your programs. And then we're able to also quickly focus on the most vulnerable communities, right? That heat map that we were just looking at took that 21% stat, which we know is different based on the place, and really helps you drill down to the places where this is the most significant issue, or one of the most significant issues affecting households. And then track that over time at the neighborhood level. So, in some of our work in child and early forced marriage, for example, we've seen countries with a national statistic of child marriage, prevalence and burden remaining constant over 10 years, over 15 years. But when you apply frames methods to that data and drill down to the community level, you see there are communities with significant improvement and significant decline on that issue. And we can see that in terms of any indicator that we are tracking over time, and unmask what is happening subnationally. Next slide, please. So what does this mean in practice? I wanted to focus on some of our more recent data in Kenya. And I think what's interesting here, when we look at neighborhood level trust in institutions, we're able to not only look at institutions in general, but understand trust in specific and key institutions and the differences by place, to again unpack the levers that we want to pull, the potential opportunities to and entry points for a community. And so in this example, as we zoom into Nairobi, we're looking at a set of key institutions and seeing some significant trust issues with the police service, but relatively high trust in defense forces, in religious leaders, and kind of a medium level trust in your traditional and traditional leaders and county assembly members. And I think that this type of information not only kind of disaggregates the question of who do you trust, but then we can also drill down into the why and bring that data together with socioeconomic characteristics. So who lives in this community? Who in this square kilometer, in this neighborhood, who does not trust the police force? Who are they? Is it a high income community, a low income community? What kind of assets and resources do you have in that neighborhood? And how involved are some of these institutional actors in your community? Next slide, please. So thinking about this data in action, to round us out, we're bringing a practical application of knowing exactly where to start. So where are the communities that have low levels or high levels of trust that can be an opportunity or an entry point into a community? Understanding the underlying drivers. So what are the household level perceptions, not only in the institution, but getting into the why, thinking about the consequences of ineffective governance. And then thinking about how to address those drivers. So with this level of granularity and spatial data, you can link up with the location of community centers, the location of schools, and think about points of entry, community institutions that allow you to act upon this new level of insight. What does the infrastructure look like? What are some of the operational challenges? Are we working in a place where, yes, crime is a major issue, but also food security is my top concern? And I'm trying, and when we think about prioritization of efforts, there are programs that can go hand in hand to address the complex challenges, the complex opportunities that present themselves in one neighborhood at a time. So I hope that this presentation kind of brings some of the conversations we've had together, starting with the history of AI and a baseline understanding of how AI works with data miner and social media data, using human reviewed data to feed into forecasting conflict, which is incredibly important when we think about the context within each community. And then thinking about sentiment data from Riwi on thinking about new tech and ways to reach diverse population. Frame at our core is about ingesting those types of data, being inclusive about our voices, and producing neighborhood level data on critical indicators so that you can action at the places that are most in need and monitor progress over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to all of our panelists. Definitely appreciated all of your insights and discussing what solutions your companies and you are working on. We'll now go ahead and transition into the Q&A portion of this session. We have a couple of questions already and a couple from earlier, so we'll go ahead and dive into those. But if you thought of any questions as our panelists were sharing, feel free to pop those into the chat so that we can make sure that we address them. So we'll start with some questions for Data Miner. Sam specifically, can you tell us if you've seen the amount of publicly available information increase in the last 10 years? And if so, what data has entered the picture recently?
Yeah, the short answer is exponentially, right? And as I detailed in the beginning of my slides, what was once just social media, for example, has gone in leaps and bounds to become, sensor networks, flight transponders, multitudes of data that not only has increased in the breadth, but the regions and types of data have increased as well. And, per the point I initially made, I think the major development in history that we've seen that has brought this data to such a surge in the last 2 years in particular is cheap mobile phones, right? And access to 4G, 5G, even 3G that allows someone in a remote area to, see a plane crash, right? And automatically go to their phone and say something about it. It allows that data to access. So I would, just to go back, I would say that, some of the main new PAI that we've been seeing have been, within radio networks. Flight aware is an interesting one, right? So flight sensor networks, and also types of PAI, releases and things like that in the deep and dark web. Very exciting for us to kind of move from, what was once just social media to a huge plethora of PAI.
Thanks, Sam. We got another question for you. What is the value of real-time information in peacekeeping?
Yeah, it's a really important one. So ultimately, I concluded my slides by giving a few examples, and for a peacekeeper who is in the field, knowing about things happening first is an incredibly important way to reorient and to maintain awareness in an environment that could be, for lack of better words, dangerous, right? When I've worked with peacekeepers, from the Congo, I was on the phone with Afghanistan today. These are the types of this information, if sent appropriately, right, allows them to stay just one step ahead of something happening, right? It allows them to maintain awareness of their environment and allows them to render and deliver services ultimately that is at the core of their mission. So we say it at Data know first, act faster, and that's kind of where we see the value.
Wonderful, thank you. Alex, we can move on to you and the questions we have for you. The first one is, what advances in artificial intelligence or machine learning technologies have helped aid in safely and efficiently managing publicly available information?
So I think it's a convergence of the three things that I mentioned earlier. One is advances in the algorithms and techniques to process large amounts of data. And the biggest one in that space is a family of techniques called deep learning. And basically what they do is, with lots and lots of data, they're able to identify patterns that are not visible otherwise. And so one example of this might be if you're doing just keyword matching, where you're looking for words that have specific spelling in public data, you'll get a lot of noise because words don't necessarily, the things you're interested in may not match exactly what you're typing in. And what you really want to find is concepts that are related semantically, that have similar meaning. An event can be expressed in many different ways, right? And so if you try to find the exact way in which an event is expressed, it's harder to find than if you are able to somehow collect all of those expressions into a platform that is able to identify them. So the algorithms have improved in being able to identify those patterns. So things that are expressed differently map to sort of the same semantic space, meaning they're found to be similar. So this allows the discovery of events at scale. And then the third one is, the access to compute, meaning computers. You need a lot of computers to run these algorithms and these models at scale. And so the cloud have allowed us to do that. It's expensive to run, but you can run these models on thousands of computers, which allows us to process, in our case, over 500,000 public data sources, images, video, audio, sensor data, text in many languages and formats. So it's really convergence of those things plus the expertise. You need a lot of expertise to be able to know how to put together the algorithms, how to build the models, how to test them, how to train them, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. So how do you leverage that with all the publicly available information, where time is of the essence and noise and misinformation are on the rise?
Yeah, so I think it was Katayun who also talked a little bit about training. Most AI models are based on training, and there are kind of two components to them. One part is where they're trained with data without any labeling, and the other part, you train them for specific tasks. So for instance, in our case, I said, we're processing over 500,000 data sources. So it's a lot of data coming in every minute, every second, right? So large scale. So when they come into the platform tries to determine what I often call the 6 W's. First of all, was it an event or not, or is it garbage? If it's an event, that's what we care about in the data miner case. Then where was the event? What happened? Et cetera, et cetera. So a bunch of variables, and each of these is a model. And for each of those models, you have to collect training data, you have to tweak parameters, you have to define the architecture. So it's very sophisticated, but at the end of the day, kind of that's that's how it works conceptually. You have tons of data coming in, and you have thousands of models which combined try to identify patterns and determine if an event happened, and then what was the event, how important it was, and then to send it out to the people that need it. And that process is actually, on one hand, identifying events, but on the other hand, it's also filtering out a lot of the noise, because it's, if you type shots on Twitter to search for shots, you'll get all kinds of shots. People taking shots of tequila, shots fired. You'll take, shot playing golf, basketball. So you get a lot of noise, right? So these models will actually filter out all the stuff that's not relevant and identify only what's really important. So that's the power of AI, that allows us to take all of that scale, identify what's important, and send it to the right people, because everyone has different interests depending on where they are, depending on what they're doing, and what they're going to use the information for.
Definitely something that's needed. Thank you. Melissa, we have a couple questions for you. The first one is, why is hyperlocal data critical for peace building? And connected to that, what might we miss if we're only using national level data?
Yeah. There are a number of ways that we can collect data, right? There are household surveys, there are mobile phone surveys, there's online surveys. We can, with each way we designed our data to be collected, we can extract certain insights from them. Even if you think about the demographic and health survey, right? The DHS, that's designed to be sometimes representative at the state level or nationally. But when you try to drill down, you lose the ability to, because the way the survey was designed, the scale, and what Frame exists because we can take household level data that is collected through household surveys, mobile phone surveys, and predict out this neighborhood level data. So that transforms the way you can think about programming and addressing needs and prioritization from day one. It complements the face-to-face and on the ground experience of those doing the work, but helps you rapidly deploy, helps you think about the complex dynamics, and often brings in the data that we don't think about. We are able to, with Frame, bring hundreds of indicators about one neighborhood together that even if you looked at them nationally, you wouldn't get a picture of what's happening in the specific place, who is most affected, and where you would want to go next. So when I think about the use of granular data in any program, but especially when we're thinking about peace building, we're able to understand a community level trust, and the socioeconomic characteristics and the other perception indicators that allow us to drill down exactly what needs to happen where.
So connected to that, somebody from the audience wants to know if Frame links the attitude behavioral preference data to geospatial data at the neighborhood level. Yeah. And if so, are all the surveys that inform the human data collected at this level? And if not, how is it linked to the super local geospatial data?
Yeah, so that's where the power of machine learning comes into play. We're working with thousands of responses that are self-reported, right? Your own, I'm responding to a survey. My input goes into the thousands of responses. And that type of information has some geographic reference, right? We're able to say this respondent is replying from a certain place. If we're using that georeference data as an input into our model, or training data, we've heard a couple of times here today, right? The individual responses are the training data for the model. The frames technology weaves the people information with the place information. So hundreds of spatial indicators. Think the whole country's precipitation in the last month, soil quality, imagery, forest cover, all of these spatial covariates. And then that's what allows us to predict out the best estimate of what's happening in this community, the best estimate of the characteristics of this place and of the people in this place. So that's where I would think about the value chain of where we think about inputs to outputs. We have a new way of thinking about attitudinal data that might live in a survey at a national statistic, using that to predict as an input, predict out what the neighborhood level data looks like. And now you have this square kilometer. So it's not about asking the questions at each specific place. It's about having the information about a number of places and filling the gap between the two.
Hey, Melissa, thanks. That was Mika, who asked that question. And I just wanted to clarify. So are you guys do you combine like social behavioral attitudinal data from like multiple data sets, and then you're using like the IP addresses of the people who are responding to that? That's what I meant. Like, how are you? Yeah, so I understand like the concept of connecting the gaps, but especially when there's like multiple attitudinal behavioral measures from different data sources, like how are you able to say that down at that local level that these people across these different surveys think these things? Like where's the confidence in that?
I would think the way we would work with it is it would be what, each indicator, the indicators that we're comparing are from the same survey. So it's the same respondents. We're not, we're getting like a population level sample about the whole country with representativeness subnationally, and then predicting out. So we wouldn't be comparing multiple survey indicators produced from multiple surveys as direct comparisons. We would look at the time period in which it was collected and compare the time moments to each other.
Got it. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Shifting gears, Katayun, we have some questions for you. The first is, what are the strengths and limitations of machine learning models when it comes to conflict prediction?
Yeah, so I kind of got into this a bit at the end of the presentation, but it really does depend on kind of the base data that you're feeding in. And really at the heart of it, machine learning models are advanced ways of detecting patterns in data that it's difficult for humans to look at. And so it's really good in situations where there is a pattern to detect, and not so much in places where things are happening perhaps for the first time, or there's not really a comparable case for it to draw information and patterns from and apply it to this case. So in the sense of conflict, especially, there are so many factors that go into sort of tensions rising and violence emerging, that it really is, I think, a tool that should be used in some cases widely and in a very useful way, especially for sort of ongoing conflicts or places where there's been a history of violence that you can really draw a lot of information from. And in other cases, it should really be taken with a grain of salt, because it's not sort of a magic crystal ball to be able to predict an extremely rare event that has never happened in that place before. And we are also, of course, bounded by the data that we have available to us. So the more data you have, often the easier it is to create these patterns. And so especially when it comes to sort of subnational data, we are pretty limited in what's out there, which is why it's great that there's people like Frame and Data Miner that are providing sort of data to fill in these gaps that currently exist.
Wonderful. And we have an audience question for you. Does the CAS tool predict location of an event within a country at the city or town level, or is it just number of events per country?
So it predicts events by country and also by admin 1. So that's just the province level. We have the ability to try to predict all the way down to a local sort of coordinate level. We have coordinate information for all of our events in the ACLID data. That decision is sort of twofold. One is just sort of availability of data. So when you're at that sort of granular of a location, you don't have that many events historically to try to pull from to see what's happened in that one location over time. And so your predictions are going to sort of suffer as a result. We did play around sort of going, more fine grained, but there's a trade-off basically with your errors. And so we sort of decided that the admin 1 level is perhaps the happy medium in terms of being confident in our accuracy rates, but then also providing at least some subnational information. And in the future, we're going to sort of also explore looking at perhaps like locations of conflict clusters. So looking not necessarily at political boundaries, but looking at where conflict is sort of centered and trying to predict out from there how that conflict might evolve.
Thank you. Natasha, it's your turn. We have a couple questions for you. The first is, can you provide examples of fragile countries or countries in conflict where the RWE solution might work?
Yeah, I think that sometimes it's a little counterintuitive, because where we work best is actually where there's a lot of people, and it's a lot of people for that specific geographic area. So places where this works really well, surprisingly, are places like Yemen, Iran, Iraq. We do really well in. We will be faster in a place like Nigeria versus Niger, because you just simply have a lot more people on the internet. In Nigeria, we've done really fast data collection in places like Sudan and Somalia. So it's places that have a lot of people is really quite good for us.
So then in those situations, aren't the online populations who you survey different from the national populations? And assuming yes, why would people or those listening in be interested in surveying people online?
Yeah, we oftentimes get this this question where how is that going to be representative? And our solution is representative of the internet population and not of the the nationwide population. The issue here is that oftentimes there are so many problems now with response rates in other types of surveys, whether it be phone surveys or face-to-face surveys. And with these very bad non-response rates now, we've got a problem of trying to figure out, well, how, where, if you are no longer picking up the phone, then where are we going to find you? And we just find that we get a lot more people now who are willing to answer questions online rather than picking up a phone or answering some random text. Because I don't know about you, but the last time I picked up some random phone number was a really, really long time ago. So that's what this solves for. There are many situations where people are interested in looking at the online population because we are looking possibly at an online intervention. You're deploying something that is with mobile money. We're looking at ways to expand an app for food security and agriculture, or you're looking at online gender-based violence. Looking at doing assessments of what kind of violence is being perpetrated with young girls, across whether it's Facebook, Instagram, and things like that. So you have to be able to go and find people where they are, and that's going to be online.
Good to know. Thank you. We have a couple questions for all of our panelists today. So the first one is asking if any of your organizations work with academics or practitioners from the field of science and technology, specifically those that are known for critiquing algorithms, the black box nature of emerging tech, unintended consequences, etc. And if so, to what extent do they influence your team and work? And if not, why not? Anybody want to take a stab?
Yeah, I can say a little bit. So we definitely do. There's sometimes misconceptions. People think like they're the critics and then the technologists and they're separate, but that's often not the case. Most of us that are building these models and working on this are very aware, and we're doing our best. And just to give you an example, I'm actually in Austin for the web conference, which is the main conference, the main technical conference on the World Wide Web. And it started when the web started. It happens every year. And I'm chairing the Web for Good track. And the whole goal of that track is to attract work that focuses on technologies for good, AI for good, web for good. And we had a lot of conversations around all of the issues that have to do with the application of AI technologies. One of the keynotes at the conference also focused on that. And there are real limitations in terms of explainability and what the models do inside, and they're active research topics in the technical community. On top of that, as I announced earlier, we're doing this program where we work with non-for-profits, and we have domain experts within our company that also help us address some of the issues. So for us, and I think for most people working in tech, I would say it's a constant. We're continuously monitoring what the models do and doing our best to make sure we address any potential problems in how they perform and what they do.
Thank you, Alex. Anybody else want to chime in? If not, we have another question from the audience. We have 2 minutes left, so hopefully we can cover it. So it states, conflict is complex. Humans misunderstand what data is relevant and how it is relevant all the time. And even with the best models, there are surprises in the real world. What are the vulnerabilities of artificial intelligence to human error or unexpected factors and events? And how can we use artificial intelligence responsibly, keeping those vulnerabilities in mind?
I mean, I can take that one as well if no one else has a response. In our case, we do have a team of domain experts who are helping us with labeling, and also in our real-time processes. It's kind of part of the platform. We have people like Sam have worked in the field, and again, our partners give us a lot of feedback, our customers and partners. And since our focus is on real time, that means we're continuously updating and improving our models, and that's a big part of it. But unlike traditional engineering, when you're building AI systems, one of the things that you need to do is continuously check the performance of the models once they're deployed. And so that's part of our framework and how we work.
Wonderful. Very short and succinct, which is what we needed. So with that, we are at time, and I want to just thank very quickly our panelists for sharing and answering these questions with us, and thank the audience for participating and answering the thought-provoking questions. So thank you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference and the rest of your day.